Dankjewel, Rob. Goedemorgen, everyone. Hoewel ik Nederlands spreek, ik doe mijn presentatie vanmorgen in het Engels. Al mijn slides zijn in het Engels. Maar het is een voorrecht en een eer om hier aanwezig te zijn. Ik heb groot respect voor die BAM Nederland team, het BAM Nederland team. En dus dank jullie voor jullie vertrouwen in mij. Father, I pray this morning that as we speak, Lord, you would give us eyes to see and ears to hear. God, what you would say to each one of us. Yes, my husband and I, we lead a charismatic church in Amsterdam. I grew up Calvinist until the Holy Spirit kind of knocked me over the head. I lead an organization, indeed, two organizations. This one's called Economic Summit. We exist to introduce new paradigms on finance and economy which are inspired by Christian tradition, faith, and thought, and to present transformational businesses as new models for poverty alleviation and sustainable economies. This is the Christian arm of what we do. Essentially, I'm not an economist, I will say that up front. I have a PhD in chemistry and also in semi and superconductor technology. But God seems to like economics. And so that is why I'm here. My field in which I work, and you'll notice that as I speak today, is not the church space. When the Lord called me to get busy with the economic space, he asked me a question. He said, Arleen, can you preach the gospel without sounding religious? And so essentially, that means I use the Bible text, but instead of saying Proverbs 11:28, I say King Solomon 950 before Christ. Truth is truth, however you place it. And these days, it's great to be able to speak before a Christian audience. I think some of the audiences I speak in front of usually are shamans, witch doctors, the captains of industry of the world. These are the people who are deciding which way the world is going to go, business, economics-wise, health-wise. And one of the things that being able to hear the voice of God does is it enables you to have wisdom that is greater than that which the world can offer. This is a day and age, I believe, in which Daniel 1 verse 20 has to apply to each one of us. When the king tested Daniel and his friends, after 3 years of training, he found them to be better, 10 times better in wisdom and in understanding than the rest. That's not a normal human level of understanding. That is a supernatural level of understanding, and that is my prayer for these 2 days as we are together for this BAM Netherlands conference, that God would give each one of you something very specific that you can take away. All right, so that's the Economic Summit. Next slide, please. And the Economic Summit, founded in 2014, I'll just do a short introduction, but after we'd been busy for about 4 or 5 years, we are busy with a concept called mutuality. Essentially, mutuality is reciprocity. It is sharing the benefits of doing business between the business and the other stakeholders. And why the Netherlands? Because in the Netherlands, we have a long tradition of doing business this way. But after a while, just in praying, the Lord said, Arleen, I didn't call you only to mobilize Christian business people, even though that's very valuable. He said, I called you to see the economy of a nation, the Netherlands, changed. And so, together with some friends who are also believers in the Dutch Parliament and some academics from Erasmus University at Rotterdam, in 2020, we launched the Rotterdam Center for Economics of Mutuality. I'm not going to say that's the secular arm of what I do. That is the kingdom arm of what we do. Next slide, please. And at the moment, we have 2 researchers. One has just finished up his project at looking at how companies implement that concept of mutuality. I call it doing unto others as you would have them do unto you in business. In Asia, we work together with the Hanyang University in Seoul, South Korea. They're the Harvard of Korea in economics, and everybody in the group is a Christian. And when I go, I get to share with them, pray for them, and encourage them. But they are changing things. They are busy looking at how they're going to receive and prepare South Korea's economy to receive North Korean refugees. Also, when North Korea unites, they're praying for that. This one, we've got a second student, and she's just been inaugurated as a raadslid, one of the city councillors for the region of Rotterdam, for Christian Uni, but she's also our PhD student and a daughter of a pastor. But she is doing her PhD on how can the principle of mutuality serve as a behavioral norm to understand good entrepreneurial conduct for small and medium-sized enterprises. In other words, to make it simple, what are the examples in the Netherlands and Western Europe of best practices in this area? Surprise, surprise, most of the businesses that are doing this are owned by Christians. And so they're not known as BAM or as Christian businesses, but most of them are owned by believers. And so that's a little bit about what we're doing. Next slide, please. Africa, the challenges and the possibilities and the lessons. That's what I've been asked to speak about this morning, and that's what we are going to talk about indeed. A number of years ago, we've been busy in Africa actually since 2017. Next slide, please. The next slide looks at the poverty headcount ratio, and this is a graph from 2015. Essentially, these are the nations in which more than 50% of the population lives below the poverty line set for that nation. Not a Western poverty line, but a poverty line set for that nation. The darker the color, the higher the levels of poverty. I think the story is very, very clear here. In this particular graph, next slide, please. Essentially, what it's saying is that over 62% are actually sub-Saharan Africa. Those at this time it was 56.2, but a recent African Development Bank figure said that over 62% of abject poverty is found in sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide, please. Interestingly enough, if you would take the same graph and look at the highest percentage of Christians in the world, it's found in exactly the same region. Now, I'm a pastor, but one of the reasons I applaud business as mission is because if I weren't a pastor, I would almost be tempted to say, looking at the facts and the figures, I'm a facts and figures person, Christianity might not be good for the economy of your nation, if I were to say that, but we know better. And so as a result, I applaud what Business as Mission is doing to engage the church with entrepreneurs and others to see communities rise. Next slide, please. Now, challenges for sub-Saharan Africa. These graphs make it really, really clear. Graph number 1 is a trend in working age population from 15 to 64. That's the graph on your right or your left-hand side. 15 to 64, you will see an explosion, that red line, in the number of people reaching working age between now and 2055. I will skip a lot of things, but what this graph is saying is that if nothing is done, and that is why we are here as Christians, all right? Tikkun Olam, it also means to heal the world. And my absolute conviction is just like we are called and anointed to lay hands on sick bodies and speak out healing in Jesus' name. Revelation 22, the leaves of the trees are for the healing of the nations. we are also called to lay hands on sick systems now and sick nations and help them to heal in the name of Jesus. Not long ago, I presented a case to our European partner organization, SALUX. That's Latin for salt and light. And essentially, in the past, they didn't want to know us when we were busy in Africa until migration became an issue. And all of a sudden, they want to know us, which is good, which is very, very good. SALUX is led by a former domine, a former reverend. But essentially, I presented this graph to them at one of their conventions, and I said, if you think we have a challenge with immigration now, just wait. What this graph is saying is that between now and 2055, there will need to be 450 million extra jobs created on the continent of Africa to provide those coming of working age with work. At the moment, the continent only has a capacity to create 100 million of these jobs by 2055. If nothing is done, then you're going to have 350 million extra people over and above what we are seeing now who have no work and no hope and who will be forced to leave everything they know and love in order to seek out a life in which they can survive. One of the reasons why we do the work we do as Economic Summit, and we are focusing now on Africa and Netherlands with what we're doing. The Economic Summit funds the Rotterdam Center for Economics of Mutuality, is because I believe that Jesus is the hope of the nations. Whether they know him or not, he is still the hope of the nations. And one of the things that we are called and mandated to do, I'd almost see it as a holy obligation now, is to help to provide hope. Hope that doesn't disappoint, certainly spiritually, but also to nations and also to the next generation, of them being able to build up a better future. And when I say better future, I'm not talking about them getting rich, but in order for them to be able to build up some kind of future in their home nations, so that they don't feel that they have to cross a continent, which is dangerous in and of itself. It is at this point in time, only 12% of the migration from Africa happens outside of Africa. That's what we're seeing in the US, Europe, an awful lot. 12%. 88% happens within the continent itself. And that's what's leading to a lot of wars and just a lot of crises in Africa. We, as believers in Jesus Christ, are called to be reconcilers, and we're called to provide hope where we go. Next slide, please. The World Bank, actually, they have made a very, very serious, World Bank Africa competitiveness report. They said the overall aim is job creation, the concrete possibility of reaping the demographic dividend. And the demographic dividend is a situation in which more people are working than collecting pension in Africa. The report states depends crucially on the extent to which the working age population are actually employed. So obviously employment, job creation is a huge priority for sub-Saharan Africa for the next several decades. Next slide, please. I spent a lot of time about 3 or 4 years ago talking to young Africans. Because interestingly enough, I met a number of people who said to me, they said, a lot of people are listening to our elders, but who listens to us? And I realized I saw nothing from the young Africans, so I did a series of webinars, essentially on just in dialogue with young Africans to listen to them. What are they seeing as some of their challenges? They said people often don't appreciate their heritage because of what they learn in school. They've been westernized, more Western than African, therefore Africanized the system. A small example, and this is something that they're going to need to do, and that is they have Snow White in the Seven Dwarfs, in Dutch Sneeuwwitje. They said, our hair is not blonde. We don't look like the people in these kind of stories. It said, it's time for us to write our own stories. It's time for us to Africanize the system. Another thing they've said, they've lost hope that their countries and governments are there for them, especially in Nigeria. Big concerns. And so they said, encourage and mentor young people. These are challenges and opportunity to become politically active. They want to have a say in the future of their countries. One of the things that I didn't realize was that we need to change laws in many African nations. So we're going to have to work with government. Why? Because in some African nations, you cannot run for political office until you're 60 or older. All right? It's a bit different than here. Third, a lack of healthy infrastructure in healthcare, education, etc., plus concerns about safety. There are a lot of young Africans who are no longer on the continent. They left their nations to go study abroad, and now they've come, they have the chance to go back, but they won't. They have concerns about healthcare and about safety. And so we're busy engaging diaspora Africans who live abroad, to be able to reconnect with the continent, whether they move there or not. There's a lot that's being done in that area and that we're starting up. And let's just put it like this. You can read a number of them. However, next slide, please. The last point, or second last point, the church is not considered to be relevant. And that's why church reformation is so needed. It's not being salt and light. That is their opinion. Young people in Africa are leaving the church in droves. I could have called this presentation this morning some uncomfortable realities that we're facing, because we need to be able to see the situation as it is and not as we would like it to be. All right? It's being resistant to change. So they're saying, encourage Christian influencers with resources to come together and develop a long-term vision, a 50 to 100-year vision for their nation. If this doesn't happen, children will continue to be sent overseas to study and stay there. Also, money from Africans who can invest gets invested elsewhere. This leads to a brain drain, a wealth drain on the continent, and also a brave drain. Why a brave drain? English. All right, why a brave drain? Simply because those who have the courage to leave and everything and to go in search of something that is better, hope, they're the ones who are needed. They're the ones who will have the courage to take initiative, to start enterprises that will change their nations. And so these are some of the things that we can address realistically. And one of the reasons, or at least one of the advantages for us at least, of working the way we do, is we get to engage with government. We get to engage with other organizations, large scale, including the EU Parliament now, to see change come. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk to you now about a project that we're busy with. It's called a European Africa Agenda. This is also what Christians do. This is also how the prophetic manifests itself. Lord, what would you have us do between next year, 2025, and 2100, if Christ has not come before that time to help to make things better? We can't do everything, but what are the things that you would have us focus on? And so in 2022, organized a meeting in close to Cape Town, South Africa. And in 2023, part 2 of that meeting was held in Amsterdam, in our building there. And essentially, the aim was to look not at what we thought had worked, but what is actually working and what we need to unlearn. Emmy was one of the presenters there, and she did an amazing job. But essentially, our aim was to just re-examine things with regards to Africa. Tens of billions of euros have been pumped into the continent for more than 40 years, actually hundreds of billions, I'm told. And Africa is poorer today than it was 40 years ago. And so we now really have to start to re-examine what are we doing, what has worked, what has not worked, and what do we need to let go of. And so in those meetings, we examined the situation around 6 areas: obviously economics and employment. Governments, the scale of the problem is so large that government isn't able to handle that alone. I would suggest also in the Netherlands, we are facing something similar, except our problem is a little different. Agriculture was our second focus area, cities for Africa's future, women's empowerment, etc. I'm going to mention a few things: economics and employment, things that work. Let's just put it like this. I think most of us in this room realize it's good, to encourage small entrepreneurs, the individuals to start. Absolutely. But the scale of the problem in Africa requires doing things at scale that work for communities, that work for regions. And so that is what we're concentrating on. With regards to employment and economics, that brand of economics that I deal with, economics of mutuality, we are in discussion right now with GIBS, that's Gordon Institute of Business Sciences. It's a business school at the University of Pretoria. They have alumni across southern and sub-Saharan Africa. And so as a result, looking at stimulating entrepreneurship, helping those who do not have access to MBO level education to learn how to do business this way. What is doing business this way? Starts with the question, what problem did God give you your company to solve for people or planet? And then the methodology builds around it, but equips businesses uniquely to have the purpose that God gave your company for at the center of your business operation. So intrinsic and integral to that, so that your company functions profitably and at the same time solves the problem that you target to solve. So that is what we're busy with there, but also helping micro businesses to connect to the global economy, their supply lines, etc., and also local economies. There are a number of beautiful initiatives from some of those who are working with us. I get to boast about them, not me. They have their own organizations. Economic Summit is a platform organization that pulls them together, but just absolutely beautiful. I'll tell you one. At the end of this, I'm not going to focus on everything, but if I look at cities for Africa's future, the pin code of the world right now is 1114. When I say that, I mean there are 1 billion people in the Americas, North and South America together. There are approximately 1 billion in Europe, 950 million actually, approximately 1 billion. There are 1 billion, 1.4 billion actually now, on the continent of Africa, and 4 billion in Asia, including China, of course. By 2050, the pin code of the world, 2100, the pin code of the world will be 1135. That will be 1 billion in the Americas. North America's population is going to shrink, but that will be compensated for by the growth in the Southern Hemisphere, South America and Central America. Europe's population will actually shrink below 1 billion. 3 is for Africa. Between now and 2100, the population of Africa is expected to triple. No other continent in the world is going to have that kind of growth, which is why all eyes are on Africa right now, including the resources that are there to be found. And finally, Asia's population will grow by 25% from 4 to 5 billion. Yes, they will still have the largest market, but when you have 3 billion and 5 billion, then you're starting to come up against each other. But what does this population growth mean for Africa? It means very specifically that Africa will add the equivalent of 200 mega cities to the continent by the time this century is over. A mega city is defined as a city of 10 million people or more. Africa will add 200. And if you look at a graph of projections of the largest cities, the largest mega cities in the world, you see that there are a few in North America, there are quite a lot in Asia, and 2 or 3 in Africa. But the shift after 2050 is going to be remarkable. All of the largest megacities in the world will be located in Africa, all of them. And so that means they're going to shift east, and then it's going to come back and land in Africa. Once again, as believers, the Lord has taught us, think ahead. If we ask him for wisdom without doubting, he will give it. And so one of our partners is busy with a Cities for Africa future idea. Essentially, he took every verse in the Bible, he and his partners, that had something to say about cities, divided them up into 35 categories on the health and well-being of cities, and then his organization, his business, once again, businesses solving the problem of people and planet profitably. And worked together with the University of Auckland in New Zealand to create something called City IQ. And at this time, it was launched 3 years ago, it is the world's best and first non-linear tool for measuring the health and well-being of cities. And so looking at, they're still in the negotiating phase. I talked to their representative a week and a half ago in London, but looking at a project in which they will work together with the mayors of 400 of Africa's secondary cities to help them develop. So instead of just concentrating on Nairobi and all of the slums going up around that, looking at Mombasa and then the tertiary cities, and they're doing that in every sub-Saharan African nation. This is the wisdom of God as applied now to the specific problems of people. And essentially we're dealing with topics, not just urbanization, where many people are going to the cities because of the opportunities there, but rurbanization. Rurbanization means, how do you provide people living in rural areas with enough opportunities and facilities to be able to want to stay there and to help stimulate agriculture? I'm just going to shorten what I'm doing because I will keep to my time on this. One of the things that we're busy with also right now with regards to this European Africa agenda, got a number of copies with me, number of the speakers and the presenters. The content was so good that decided let's write a book about it. This is volume 1. Volume 2 will be coming in 2025. This is their stories. Emmy's contribution is here also. 10 reasons why Africa is poor. Conclusion, I loved what you said. I watched the video again last night of your talk. Stop stealing. Even as Christians, stop stealing from the continent. You can read why she says that. I love being Dutch. It allows you to be direct on quite a number of things. But this is not meant to be a book that sits on a shelf, and I'm glad that it's not sitting on the shelf. Why? Because based on Emmy's chapter, one of the main reasons why many nations in Africa are poor, French-speaking nations, is something called a Pacte Franc-Afrique. And essentially that means that every year the the French-speaking former French colonies on the continent are required to pay 500 billion euros to France. 500 billion. I used to ask myself the question, why are the French-speaking nations in Africa so much worse off than the English-speaking nations? And that's saying a lot. It's because of that Pacte Franc-Afrique, 500 billion a year, every year. And Jacques Chirac, François Mitterrand, two past French presidents, especially Mitterrand, he said, without Africa, France would be a third world nation. Why are we not doing anything about it as EU? It's because if Africa doesn't pay it, we're going to have to pay it. Selfishness. However, you can ask yourself the question, is it cheaper for us to pay that or to have all of the associated costs? Because with migration, it's not just receiving people, but their countries lose, our taxpayers pay, and the only ones who gain are a very small number of people. So, concretely, this is meant to be a concrete action thing. In the fall, we'll be hosting a large meeting in the EU Parliament, and around this theme, a European Africa agenda, one of the things is arranging a lobby group to start to draw attention to the effects of the Pacte Franc-Afrique so that it can be ended, or at least partially ended. If you only did that, the living standard, because poverty is a main driver why people do not have hope. If you only did that, the living standard of at least 13 or 14 nations would increase substantially. Just that one thing. Another thing that we're doing, I had a conversation with Prisma the other day, just talking about how these ideas, you'll read the book, we're getting actually good reviews. It's not just dry facts, it's also their stories. The stories of these presenters, awesome, actually awesome. But another thing that we'll be doing on this is helping Christian NGOs to learn how to function more effectively. I deal a lot with economics because of the Rotterdam Center for Economics of Mutuality, and one of the things that I can say to all of us who are dealing with NGOs is that the days in which you can support your NGO well, just based on gifts from business people, is now over. The economies of the world are going to continue to shake. Why? Because we are changing economic systems. 2,000 years of economic history says that every time the system gets changed, that there is intense shaking. And so as a result, as Christian NGOs, how do you prepare yourself for what is already going on? Interestingly enough, there's something called the charitable industrial complex. And that's something that I heard from a Canadian colleague. And he gave me the Canadian statistics. I do not have the European statistics, but in Canada there are 88,000 charities. And the charitable income that those charities receive, charities, NGOs, is 17% of Canadian GDP. That's huge. And he said in his presentation, remember I told you we were talking about uncomfortable truths here. He said in his presentation, essentially, that all of these charities, and they target Africa that he's talking about, 88,000 that target Africa specifically, and he said they all exist because Africa has a problem, and their continued existence depends on Africa continuing to have a problem. That's what I would call, I like Dutch sometimes, it's very succinct, a perverse prikkel. That is a motivation that is, you're doing one thing, but actually you're fighting what you're trying to help because the survival of the organization depends on Africa continuing to have a problem. So we need to start that conversation about you know, what does success look like? When is your NGO or your stichting, your foundation, no longer necessary? Could it be that it won't be necessary because you've actually solved the problem that those NGOs and foundations were created to solve in the first place? That's just one example of how we need to really start to think differently about what we're doing in Africa. I deal with a concept called mutuality. One of the speakers at the meeting, he was saying that, you know, when he went into Africa, just a few things, just to open our eyes. When he went into Africa, he was, the first question he was asked was, are you coming with a fish or a fishing rod? And obviously most of us know that question. You know, it's just you provide a fish, it's short term. You provide a fishing rod, people can fish for themselves. However, there's a new question that we need to ask, and that is, yeah, you can come with fish, you can even come with a fishing rod, but who owns the lake that you're fishing in? Who owns the lake? And so mutuality in this respect, in the NGO world, means it's about laying down our power that we have as those from the West and inviting our African partners into that power structure. Money talks, we've got the money. They don't, but they have social capital that we do not. And this particular charity is, they started as a charity. They're doing it through local ownership. And so essentially, they are busy buying huge parts of land in conjunction with the Rwandan government now, and they are inviting tens of thousands of subsistence farmers to come in. Each one gets training in how to farm a 2-hectare piece of land. But what they're also doing too is that they're connecting all of these farmers to the global economy because they have contracts with China and with other Asian nations. But what I really love about it, the mutual aspect of this, is that in all of the projects that they are doing, they have a 10-year, let's just put it, life cycle in which they own the land, and then they create agricultural cooperatives, business cooperatives, run by the Africans. They'll still leave one or two there, you know, just to make sure things continue to go well, but they are African-owned, African-run. That's what they're aiming for. And they're doing amazing stuff. And I know you guys all know Don Larson here, a guy in Mozambique, Mr. Cashew. He's been roped into that too. As a result of these meetings, there are 4 large land projects that are in the process of being developed in northwestern Ghana, where poverty levels are the highest. Islamatization is huge there, but they are moving in. They said to Don, if you can do this with cashews, what you're doing, you can do it with any agricultural product. So there's a collaboration that is gelling right there. And they're using US government funds to do that. So that's the level that they're working at. Finally, I could talk a lot further. Let's just say I'm looking at the micro challenge, but I'd really encourage you just to read the stories in the book. 2 days ago, we talked to Prisma, the leaders of that. They are the koepelorganisatie. They're the platform for all of the Christian NGOs in the Netherlands. And they've read this book. They said, we'll be reading it with all of the representatives of our 23 organizations, and we'll be coming back to you. Because there are areas that they're involved in that we're involved in. So, European Africa agenda, what's next? 27th of September, we had a meeting in Amsterdam with all of the speakers. The ones who were not in the Netherlands joined by Zoom, and the ones who were in the Netherlands were physically present to develop a strategy because we're not leaving it here. There are too many good ideas that are able to be implemented. Strategy, we may not be able to do everything in here, but what are some of the top 2 or 3 that we can do together that we can't do alone? So that lobby thing is number 1. Another thing that will be coming in, and I think I'll run 1 minute over time, I have 5 seconds. Another thing that will be coming in is that we're going to encourage the EU now and the Netherlands, because we'd like to speak to the Dutch government. So we're working on that right now, to see investment in some of these things that have been proven to work in Africa, not as ontwikkelingssamenwerking, which is foreign development. We're rephrasing that. Matt's talked about language. We don't deal with foreign development anymore. We're dealing with foreign policy, buitenlandzaken, because it affects our nation also. And last, but not least, I have a dream, and that is for the city of Rotterdam. I live in Amsterdam. Amsterdam became 2 years ago the first donut city, donut economics. Some of you may be familiar with the model invented, or at least developed by Kate Raworth, the Oxford economist. But we have a new burgemeester, or mayor, in Rotterdam. And she was the very first one I talked to about economics and mutuality. And she introduced, among other things, Eppo Browns, our current Minister of University. Hey, Gerald, this is your party. To economics and mutuality. And so me, together with a number of professors from Erasmus, will be looking at getting an appointment with Carola to talk to her about using economics and mutuality, a Christian paradigm at its heart, and the 4 capitals to measure value creation in the city of Rotterdam. So that, who knows, one day, and I get to dream, God can do a lot when you pray. The reason I'm standing here is because of that. One day, maybe, Rotterdam, Netherlands' first mutual city for the glory of God. Thank you very, very much. I have a few copies with me of this. If you want to talk to me, if you're interested in one of the breaks, be happy to make sure you get one.